Hey guys, when people imagine medieval Europe, they often picture castles, muddy streets, candlelit halls, and rough woolen cloaks. But one of the strangest realities was much closer to the skin. For many people, clothing was not something you casually changed every morning. It was expensive, slow to make, difficult to wash, and often worn again and again for days or even weeks. Before we settle into tonight's story, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what quiet corner of history you'd like us to explore next. And if you enjoy thoughtful long-form history like this, leaving a like is a simple way to support it. Subscribe as well if you'd like more calm, quietly fascinating history to return to at the end of the day. So tonight, let's step into medieval Europe not through a battlefield or a royal court, but through a shirt, a tunic, a pair of stockings, and the everyday reality of wearing the same clothes far longer than most of us would find comfortable. To understand medieval clothing, we have to begin with a modern misunderstanding. Today, clothing is often treated as personal style, convenience, hygiene, and identity all at once. Most people in modern wealthy societies can open a wardrobe and choose between several shirts, trousers, dresses, jackets, and shoes. If something smells wrong, it goes into the laundry. If something tears, it may be replaced. If the weather changes, there is usually another layer close at hand. In medieval Europe, clothing lived in a very different world. It was not disposable. It was not cheap. It was not easily replaced. A single garment represented land, animals, plants, labor, tools, skill, time, and money. Before a tunic could be worn, sheep had to be raised, wool had to be shorn, cleaned, combed, spun, woven, cut, stitched, and sometimes dyed. Linen required flax to be grown, harvested, soaked, broken, combed into fibers, spun into thread, and woven into cloth. Even the simplest piece of clothing carried within it weeks or months of human work. That is why the phrase, wearing the same clothes for weeks, meant something more complicated than neglect. For many medieval people, it was ordinary household economics. Clothes were assets. They were patched, turned, handed down, altered, pawned, inherited, and protected from needless damage. To own several full changes of clothing was not impossible, but it was not the normal starting point for the poor. A peasant household might have work clothing, perhaps a better garment for Sundays or feast days, and layers that shifted with the seasons. But a closet full of daily alternatives would have seemed like an astonishing luxury. The first thing that touched the body was usually the most important for comfort. Many people wore a linen undergarment, often a shirt or shift, beneath woolen outer clothing. Linen could absorb sweat more readily than wool, and it was easier to wash. This mattered because outer garments, especially wool, were not washed in the way we imagine washing clothes today. Wool could shrink, lose shape, become heavy, take a long time to dry, and suffer from repeated soaking. Instead, it might be brushed, beaten, aired, smoked, or spot cleaned. Dirt could be scraped away. Mud could be dried and brushed off. Smell could be managed, not erased. This is where the medieval logic begins to appear. The cleanest part of a person's clothing was not always the visible part. A linen layer next to the skin could be changed or washed more often if the household had enough linen and enough access to water, fuel, time, and drying space. The outer clothing, the part seen in public, might remain the same for a long time. To modern eyes, this sounds backwards. We often think visible clothes should be clean because other people see them. But in a medieval setting, the hidden layer did much of the hard work, while the visible layer was too valuable to treat casually. Even washing a simple garment was not a small chore. Water had to be fetched from a well, stream, fountain, or communal source. In colder weather, icy water made the work harsh. If warm water was needed, fuel had to be gathered or purchased. Wood was valuable. Time was valuable. Soap existed, but it was not always cheap, soft, pleasant, or available in abundance. Laundry might involve soaking, rubbing, beating cloth against stones or boards, using lye or alkaline substances, rinsing, wringing, and then waiting for the garment to dry. In damp seasons, drying could take a long time. In cramped homes, wet cloth added moisture to an already smoky, crowded space. So one reason people wore the same clothes again and again was simply practical. Washing was labor. Washing took resources. Washing could damage clothing. And if a person owned only one or two usable garments, washing one of them created another problem. What exactly were they supposed to wear while it dried? That question sounds almost too simple, but it reveals a great deal. Modern laundry depends on having replacement clothing. Medieval laundry often did not. A laborer could not easily go without clothing while a tunic dried. A woman working in a household or field could not pause life because her shift needed washing. A servant could not choose comfort over duty. The rhythm of clothing care had to fit around work, weather, light, social expectations, and the limited number of garments a family possessed. For a poor rural worker, the same outfit might move through many conditions in a single week. It could be worn while feeding animals before dawn, kneeling in soil, carrying bundles of wood, walking through wet grass, tending a fire, entering a church, sharing a meal, and sleeping nearby in a crowded room. Clothing absorbed the smell of smoke from the hearth, sweat from labor, dampness from rain, oils from the body, dust from floors, and the sharp scent of animals. But not all of this was considered shocking in the way modern people might imagine. The entire environment smelled different. Streets, homes, barns, kitchens, bodies, fires, leather, wool, and earth all mixed together. That does not mean medieval people did not notice bad smells. They did. They complained about filth, disliked dirt, valued clean linen, and associated neatness with dignity. But their standards were shaped by their world. Cleanliness was not absent. It was constrained. People tried to manage the body and clothing with the tools available. They aired garments. They changed underlayers when possible. They washed hands and faces. They combed hair. They used belts, pins, aprons, veils, and outer layers to protect clothing and control appearance. A person could be poor and still care deeply about being presentable. This is one of the most important corrections to make. Medieval Europe was not a world where everyone simply accepted filth without thought. It was a world where cleanliness had to be negotiated. A person's appearance could affect reputation, employment, marriage prospects, religious life, and social standing. To look ragged, stained, or disordered could invite judgment. But to keep clothing fresh required resources. The tension between dignity and poverty was always there, quietly stitched into the seams. The materials themselves shaped the experience of wearing clothes for long periods. Wool was common because it was warm, flexible, and widely produced in many parts of Europe. It could be spun and woven in different weights, from coarse cloth for laborers to finer fabrics for the wealthy. It held heat well, even in damp weather, which made it practical in colder climates. But coarse wool against the skin could itch, especially if the weave was rough or the garment poorly finished. That is another reason linen underclothing mattered. It created a softer barrier between the body and the wool. Linen, however, was not equally available to everyone in the same quantity or quality. A wealthy person could own multiple linen shirts, shifts, headcloths, towels, and bed linens. Their household might employ servants whose work included laundering and maintaining these items. The poor might have far fewer pieces and had to stretch their use. The difference between rich and poor was not simply that the rich looked better. It was that the rich could afford more frequent changes between skin and cloth. Their cleanliness could be outsourced. In a castle or wealthy urban home, clothing management was part of household order. Garments were stored, folded, brushed, scented, mended, and protected from insects and damp. Fine clothes might be lined with fur, trimmed, dyed, embroidered, or cut in fashionable shapes. They were signs of rank, but also fragile investments. A noble garment was not casually thrown into a tub. It might be cleaned by careful methods, aired, brushed, and repaired by skilled hands. The rich could own more clothing, but they also owned clothing that required more careful treatment. This creates a quiet irony. The people most able to own many garments often wore the most delicate and expensive ones, while the people least able to replace clothing had to wear theirs through the hardest labor. A peasant's clothing needed to survive mud, sweat, weather, smoke, tools, animals, and repeated strain. A noble's clothing needed to survive politics. The wrong fabric, the wrong color, the wrong cut, or clothing that seemed too plain or too extravagant could send a message. In medieval society, clothing did not merely cover the body. It placed the body in a hierarchy. Laws and customs sometimes reinforced this. In different periods and regions, sumptuary rules attempted to control who could wear certain fabrics, furs, colors, ornaments, or styles. These rules were not always enforced consistently, and they varied widely, but their existence tells us something important. Clothing was considered socially powerful, could blur rank, could imitate wealth, could challenge order. The same tunic worn for weeks by a poor worker might signal necessity, while a carefully chosen gown or robe could signal authority, ambition, office, or lineage. But most medieval people were not thinking in grand symbolic terms every morning. They were thinking about warmth, modesty, labor, and survival. Clothing had to work. A belt could gather a tunic and hold tools or a pouch. A hood could protect the head from rain. A cloak could become a blanket. Shoes, when available, had to survive rough ground, though many poor people had limited footwear and might go barefoot in certain seasons or tasks. Stockings or hose could be patched repeatedly. Aprons could shield the main garment from food, soot, and dirt. Head coverings could protect hair and signal respectability. The body inside these clothes lived close to the seasons. In winter, wearing the same garments for weeks could be uncomfortable, but warmth mattered more than freshness. Layers trapped heat. Wool, even worn long and smoky, could be life-preserving. People slept in clothing or kept garments close during cold nights. Homes were often poorly insulated. Floors could be cold. Drafts entered through gaps. A fire warmed one part of a room while the rest remained chilly. In that setting, removing layers for the sake of cleanliness was not always practical or safe. Summer brought a different problem. Heat, sweat, insects, and labor made clothing feel heavy and sour more quickly. A linen underlayer could help, but only if it could be washed or changed. Woolen outer garments might be loosened, sleeves rolled, layers reduced, or lighter cloth used when available. But modesty and custom still mattered. People did not simply dress for comfort in a modern sense. They dressed within expectations about gender, status, work, and respectability. A person could not always choose the coolest garment if it exposed too much, looked improper, or failed to mark their place in society. And then there was the issue no one could fully escape: insects. Clothing worn for long stretches could attract fleas, lice, and other pests. Medieval people knew these irritations well. Bedding, straw mattresses, clothing seams, hair, and crowded living spaces all created opportunities for infestation. People scratched, combed, picked, shook garments, aired bedding, and used various household methods to manage the problem. But complete control was difficult. In a world where people lived close to animals, shared sleeping spaces, and had limited washing facilities, The small discomforts of clothing were part of daily life. This is where the experience becomes more intimate than a simple statement about dirty clothes. Wearing the same clothing for weeks was not just about smell. It was about texture, weight, dampness, irritation, social anxiety, and constant adjustment. A seam could rub the same place again and again. Patch could stiffen. A damp hem could brush against the legs. Smoke could cling to wool. A belt could press into the waist. Shoes could soften in mud and stiffen as they dried. Clothing was not a neutral background. It was a physical presence. Yet because garments were so valuable, people learned to live with imperfections. A tear was not the end of a garment. It was a repair waiting to happen. Patches were normal. Recutting was normal. Turning cloth, remaking old garments for children, and reusing fabric for smaller items were part of household thrift. Cloth might become clothing, then patches, then wrapping, then rags. A garment's life could be long and layered. Even when it no longer looked impressive, it still held usefulness. In towns, the story became even more complicated. Urban life brought artisans, markets, trade, regulations, and more visible social comparison. A townsperson might see finer cloth more often than a rural peasant did. They might pass merchants, clergy, apprentices, servants, beggars, officials, and travelers in the same streets. Clothing marked occupation as well as wealth. Certain trades left their own stains and smells. A butcher, dyer, tanner, cook, blacksmith, baker, or washerwoman carried traces of work on cloth and body. In a crowded town, everyone could read something from what others wore. But towns also offered access to second-hand clothing. Used garments circulated through markets, pawnbrokers, servants, inheritance, and charity. A cloak that had lost favor with a wealthier owner could become valuable to someone poorer. Clothing theft was taken seriously because garments were worth stealing. A stolen cloak or tunic represented real value. In some cases, clothes could function almost like portable wealth, something that could be pawned in hardship or passed along in a will. That value explains why medieval clothing often appears in records. Inventories, wills, court cases, household accounts, guild regulations, and moral writings. People recorded garments because they mattered. A cloak, gown, hood, belt, or pair of sheets might be listed carefully, sometimes with details about color, fabric, lining, or condition. These records remind us that clothing was not background decoration. It was part of the economy of life. For women, clothing care often meant extra labor. Spinning, sewing, mending, washing, and maintaining household textiles were frequently tied to women's work, though men also worked in textile trades and clothing production. In many households, the making and keeping of cloth was a continuous burden. A garment worn for weeks did not simply exist. Someone had to keep it wearable. Someone noticed the tear, saved the scrap, patched the sleeve, washed the linen, hung it to dry, folded it, and stretched its usefulness as long as possible. This gives the subject a quieter emotional weight. The same clothes worn again and again were not always signs of neglect. Often, they were signs of care under pressure. A patched tunic might show poverty, but it also showed that someone had spent time repairing it. A repeatedly washed linen shift might show wear, but it also showed effort. A child's clothing cut down from an adult garment might show limited means, but also household planning. Medieval clothing tells a story not only of discomfort, but of endurance. There is also a religious and moral layer. Medieval Christian culture often placed meaning on clothing, modesty, humility, and the body. Monks and nuns wore habits that signaled discipline and separation from worldly vanity. Some saints' lives praised plain or rough clothing as spiritual humility. At the same time, Churchmen criticized excessive luxury, elaborate fashion, and pride in appearance. Clothing could be morally charged. Too fine, too revealing, too vain, too ragged, too rich for one's station, or too careless for respectability. But ordinary people still wanted to look decent. This is another expectation reversal. The Middle Ages were not a place where everyone rejected appearance as vanity. People cared about color, fit, fabric, and impression. Dyes could make clothing more desirable, though bright and stable colors often cost more. Even a modest person might value a better garment for church, festivals, weddings, or market days. These moments mattered because clothing allowed people to appear not just as workers, but as members of a community with dignity. Imagine, then, a medieval villager preparing for a feast day. The everyday work garment may be stained, smoky, patched, and softened by long use, but stored away, perhaps wrapped or folded carefully. There may be a better tunic, a cleaner shift, a finer hood, or a cloak reserved for public moments. It might not be new. It might not be fashionable by noble standards. But compared with daily clothing, it marks a change. It allows the person to step briefly out of labor and into ceremony. That contrast between daily wear and special clothing tells us something essential. Medieval people did not necessarily wear the same clothes constantly because they did not know any better. They did so because daily life consumed clothing. Work damaged it. Weather challenged it. Smoke filled it. Money limited it. Washing strained it. And social life required saving the best pieces for the moments when appearance mattered most. So when we ask what it was like to wear the same clothes for weeks in medieval Europe, we should not imagine one simple answer. For the poor, it could mean discomfort, smell, itching, dampness, and the constant worry of wearing out the only garments they had. For workers, it meant clothing shaped by labor, repaired until it nearly became a map of the body's daily tasks. For servants, it might mean wearing livery or practical garments under the eye of a household that expected both neatness and obedience. For the wealthy, it meant owning more options, but also managing clothes as symbols of rank, status, and reputation. And beneath all of it was a truth that modern life often hides from us. Cloth was precious because labor was precious. Every thread had passed through human hands. Every garment carried time inside it. That is why medieval clothing cannot be understood only through the question of cleanliness. It has to be understood through cost, work, climate, status, gender, religion, household management, and the physical demands of daily survival. The same shirt, shift, tunic, gown, or cloak could be a source of warmth, shame, pride, irritation, protection, and identity all at once. As we move deeper into this world, the next question becomes even more revealing. If clothing was so expensive, so difficult to wash, and so closely tied to reputation, then how did medieval people actually try to keep themselves respectable while living in garments that modern viewers might find almost impossible to tolerate? Respectability in that world was not usually achieved by being perfectly clean in the modern sense. It was achieved by managing appearances carefully enough that a person did not seem careless, disorderly, or degraded. A medieval man or woman might not have been able to change clothing every day, but they could smooth a garment, fasten it properly, cover stained areas with an apron or cloak, keep a head covering neat, brush off visible dirt, and preserve one better item for church, market, or feast days. Much of medieval presentation depended on making limited clothing look intentional rather than desperate. This is why the small pieces of clothing mattered so much. A hood, veil, cap, belt, apron, or clean linen edge could change how a person appeared. A person might wear the same outer garment for a long stretch, but if the linen at the neck or wrist looked cleaner, if the belt sat properly, if the head covering was orderly, the whole body seemed more respectable. In a society where most people understood poverty, People did not expect everyone to look rich, but they did expect signs of care. The head, especially, carried social meaning. In many parts of medieval Europe, married women commonly covered their hair in public, not only for warmth or practicality, but as a sign of modesty and social order. Men wore caps, hoods, coifs, or hats depending on class, region, and work. These coverings protected hair from dust, smoke, sun, cold, and dirt, but they also helped maintain public dignity. A person's hair might not be freshly washed, but a clean or properly arranged head covering could keep the public face of the body under control. This was one of the hidden strategies of medieval clothing. Not everything had to be washed if it could be covered, layered, brushed, aired, or kept away from the worst dirt. The body was managed in zones. Linen close to the skin absorbed sweat. Outer wool protected against weather. Aprons protected the front of a garment during work. Cloaks shielded clothing from rain and cold. Head coverings protected hair and signaled propriety. Belts pulled loose clothing into a usable shape. Clothing was not just worn, it was organized. And the organization mattered because clothing was always being watched. In a small village, people knew each other's circumstances. They noticed when someone had a new cloak, when a garment had been patched too many times, when a bride wore something unusually fine, when a servant appeared in livery, or when a laborer came to church in clothing that seemed too dirty for the occasion. In towns where strangers met more often, clothing became an even faster language. A person's garments told others what work they did, what wealth they might have, whether they belonged, whether they were respectable, and sometimes whether they could be trusted. Yet the same clothing could tell different stories depending on context. Mud on a field worker's hem was ordinary. Grease on a cook's apron made sense. Dye stains on a cloth worker's hands or sleeves might mark trade rather than disgrace. But dirt in the wrong place at the wrong moment could be socially damaging. A garment acceptable in the field might look shameful in church. A stained work tunic might be normal on a weekday and embarrassing at a wedding. Medieval people lived with this constant shifting line between practical dirt and public shame. To keep that line from being crossed, households developed routines. Clothing was shaken out. Wool could be brushed to remove dried mud, straw, dust, and loose dirt. Garments might be hung outside when weather allowed, letting wind carry away dampness and smoke. Sunlight, when available, helped dry and freshen cloth. In smoky homes, airing garments was not a luxury. It was one of the few ways to separate the smell of the hearth from the smell of the body. Even a poor household might understand that a garment left damp and folded could become unpleasant or damaged. The problem was that medieval houses often fought against cleanliness. Many ordinary homes were dark, smoky, and crowded. The central fire, essential for warmth and cooking, released smoke that could cling to hair, bedding, walls, and wool. Floors might be beaten earth, rushes, boards, or stone depending on wealth and region. Animals could live close by or even inside parts of the household structure. Bedding was limited. Storage was vulnerable to damp, mice, insects, and mold. A garment carefully washed or aired could quickly return to the smells of the home. This is one reason medieval people valued storage. Chests, boxes, pegs, shelves, and cloth wrappings were not just furniture. They were forms of protection. A better garment kept in a chest was safer from soot, daily wear, and accidental damage. Lavender, rosemary, southernwood, or other aromatic plants might be used in some households to scent or deter pests, though practices varied widely by place and class. The larger point is that people did not simply leave clothing to decay around them. They tried, within their means, to defend cloth from the household itself. There was another method that modern viewers sometimes overlook: fulling and professional cloth care. In towns, some textile work involved specialized labor. Fullers cleaned, thickened, and finished woolen cloth through processes that could include water, beating, pressure, and cleansing agents. This was not the same as weekly personal laundry, but it reminds us that medieval Europe had textile knowledge. People understood cloth as a material that could be treated, improved, finished, repaired, and maintained. The difficulty was not ignorance. The difficulty was access, cost, and circumstance. The same is true of soap. Medieval Europe was not soapless. Soap making existed in various forms, and some regions became known for it. But soap was not distributed into every household with the cheap abundance modern people expect. Some soaps were harsher, some were costly, and some were reserved for particular uses. Ordinary laundering could also rely on lye, ash, urine-based cleaning processes in certain textile contexts, or simple water and friction. To modern ears, some of these methods sound unpleasant, but they had practical chemistry behind them. Alkaline substances break down grease. Fermented urine, used in some textile processing, provided ammonia. What sounds strange now could make sense in a world without modern detergents. This is a useful place to pause inside the medieval mind. Cleanliness was not understood only through scent or sterility. It was tied to visible order, moral discipline, bodily balance, and social place. Medieval medical ideas, influenced by humoral theory, often interpreted the body through heat, cold, dryness, moisture, and the management of internal balance. Bathing, sweating, diet, clothing, and air were all thought to affect health. People could value washing and still fear certain kinds of exposure, chill, or bodily imbalance. Their choices were shaped by a medical worldview that was not ours, but it was not random. Public baths existed in many medieval towns, especially in certain periods and regions. Bathhouses could be places of washing, socializing, rest, and sometimes moral anxiety. Some were respectable. Others gained reputations for disorder or sexual immorality. Over time, attitudes toward public bathing shifted, especially with changing disease fears, religious concerns, urban regulation, and social suspicion. But the presence of bathhouses complicates the lazy image of medieval Europeans as people who never washed. The reality was uneven. Some washed regularly by the standards of their world. Others had little access. Some valued baths. Others avoided them. Class, city, season, occupation, and local custom all mattered. Still, even bathing did not solve the clothing problem. A washed body placed back into the same worn undergarment and smoky wool would quickly return to the textures and smells of daily life. This is why linen was so important. In some medieval thinking, changing linen could stand in for more complete bodily washing because the linen absorbed impurities from the skin. A clean shirt or shift could make the body feel renewed even if the outer garments stayed the same. For those who could afford enough linen, this was a powerful comfort. For those who could not, the body remained closer to its clothing for longer. The wealthy understood this distinction very well. Their wardrobes could include multiple shirts, shifts, hose, caps, veils, towels, napkins, and bedding textiles. They might not wash their most elaborate outer garments frequently, but they could change the layer beneath. A nobleman might wear fine wool or silk outside, but the sensation of cleanliness came from fresh linen beneath it. A noblewoman's gown might be carefully maintained rather than washed, while her shifts and head linens were laundered more often by servants. Cleanliness, for the upper classes, was partly the ability to keep replacing the hidden layer. For the poor, the hidden layer was often where hardship became most personal. A linen shirt worn too long could become stiff with sweat, oils, and dirt. Seams could irritate the skin. The underarms, collar, and cuffs would show wear first. If washed harshly, linen could fray. If not washed enough, it could smell and itch. If a person had only one good undergarment, They had to choose between wearing it dirty, washing it and waiting, or managing with something worse while it dried. None of these options were ideal. All of them were ordinary. Rain made everything harder. A wet cloak could become heavy. A woolen garment could hold moisture for hours. Shoes could fill with mud. Hose could cling coldly to the legs. In an age before central heating, drying clothing was a serious matter. A garment hung near a fire could dry, but it could also absorb smoke or risk scorching. In a crowded household, there might not be enough space to dry everything properly. Damp clothing against the body could chill a person, and damp stored clothing could grow musty. Weeks in the same clothes did not always mean constant dry dirt. Sometimes it meant moving in and out of dampness, never fully fresh, never fully ruined, always somewhere between. The colder months created their own logic. People layered clothing and often preferred to keep garments on because warmth was precious. Removing layers to wash the body or clothing could mean discomfort, risk, and lost heat. A winter shirt might be worn longer than a summer one simply because changing required exposure to cold air. Bedding, if limited, could be supplemented by clothing. A cloak might serve at night. A hood might remain nearby. A person's daily clothing was part of their sleeping environment, and the boundary between daywear and bedding was often less firm than it is now. In summer, the opposite pressure appeared. Sweating increased, insects multiplied, and labor intensified during agricultural seasons. Harvest work could be physically demanding, dusty, and hot. Clothes might be loosened or simplified, but they still needed to protect the skin from sun, tools, rough plants, and public exposure. A person wearing the same clothing through summer labor would feel the garment change day by day. Softer in some places, harsher in others, marked by salt, dust, and the repeated motions of work. Those repeated motions shaped the clothing itself. The elbows thinned, knees strained, shoulders wore under loads, hems collected dirt, belts left creases, shoes bent at the same points. A garment became fitted not by tailoring alone, but by use. It held the memory of the body's work. A tunic worn for weeks in the field was not just dirty. It was adapted, stretched, stained, and softened by routine. For some people, that familiarity may have brought comfort. The same garment that irritated the skin also moved with the body in known ways. Poverty often forces intimacy with objects. Children experienced this world differently, but no less intensely. Their clothes were commonly passed down, altered, patched, and remade. A child might wear garments cut from older cloth, already softened by another life. Sleeves could be too long, hems let down as the child grew, patches added wherever play and work wore through. Children dirted clothing quickly, yet households could least afford constant replacement. The result was a practical tolerance for stains, repairs, and imperfect fit. A child's clothing showed not only poverty, but growth itself. Servants occupied another complicated position. Some servants wore clothing provided by their employers, especially in larger households. Livery could mark belonging to a lord or household, offering a kind of status and visibility. But it could also mark dependency. A servant's clothing had to reflect well on the household, which meant neatness could become part of obedience. The servant might possess little personal choice, yet be judged by appearance constantly. Their clothes were not only garments. They were signs of someone else's order. Among clergy and religious communities, clothing took on another form of discipline. Monastic habits were often designed to be plain, durable, and symbolic. The repeated wearing of simple clothing could express humility, obedience, and separation from luxury. But even here, garments had to be maintained. A habit could be patched. Linen could be washed. Rules could govern how many garments a monk or nun possessed, when they were issued, and how they were cared for. Religious simplicity did not remove material reality. It organized it under spiritual meaning. There is a quiet tension here between necessity and virtue. The poor might wear the same garment because they had no choice. The monk might wear plain clothing as a chosen discipline. The noble might wear the same expensive outer garment repeatedly because it was too valuable to wash casually. From the outside, all three might involve repeated wear. But the meaning was different in each case. Medieval clothing always requires us to ask not only what was worn, but why, by whom, and under what pressure. The pressure was especially visible in moments of transition. Weddings, funerals, church festivals, market days, legal appearances, seasonal fairs. These were times when clothing could lift someone slightly above ordinary life or expose how limited their household truly was. A family might borrow, alter, or carefully prepare clothing for such events. A bride's clothing, for instance, did not always resemble the modern white wedding dress. It depended on region, class, and means. The best available garment might be used, or a newly made item if the household could afford it. Clothing marked the seriousness of the moment. Funerals also reveal the value of cloth. The dead might be wrapped, dressed, or buried according to custom, status, and religious practice. Textiles could accompany the final passage, but cloth was valuable enough that choices mattered. The living needed garments too. In poorer households, the death of a person could leave behind clothing that became inheritance, charity, or practical survival for others. A cloak could outlive its owner. A shirt could be cut down. A belt could pass to another waist. The material world did not vanish with the person. It continued through use. Rain made everything harder. A wet cloak could become heavy. A woolen garment could hold moisture for hours. Shoes could fill with mud. Hose could cling coldly to the legs. In an age before central heating, drying clothing was a serious matter. A garment hung near a fire could dry, but it could also absorb smoke or risk scorching. In a crowded household, there might not be enough space to dry everything properly. Damp clothing against the body could chill a person, and damp stored clothing could grow musty. Weeks in the same clothes did not always mean constant dry dirt. Sometimes it meant moving in and out of dampness, never fully fresh, never fully ruined, always somewhere between. The colder months created their own logic. People layered clothing and often preferred to keep garments on because warmth was precious. Removing layers to wash the body or clothing could mean discomfort, risk, and lost heat. A winter shirt might be worn longer than a summer one simply because changing required exposure to cold air. Bedding, if limited, could be supplemented by clothing. A cloak might serve at night. A hood might remain nearby. A person's daily clothing was part of their sleeping environment, and the boundary between daywear and bedding was often less firm than it is now. In summer, the opposite pressure appeared. Sweating increased, insects multiplied, and labor intensified during agricultural seasons. Harvest work could be physically demanding, dusty, and hot. Clothes might be loosened or simplified, but they still needed to protect the skin from sun, tools, rough plants, and public exposure. A person wearing the same clothing through summer labor would feel the garment change day by day. Softer in some places, harsher in others, marked by salt, dust, and the repeated motions of work. Those repeated motions shaped the clothing itself. The elbows thinned, knees strained, shoulders wore under loads, hems collected dirt, belts left creases, shoes bent at the same points. A garment became fitted not by tailoring alone, but by use. It held the memory of the body's work. A tunic worn for weeks in the field was not just dirty. It was adapted, stretched, stained, and softened by routine. For some people, that familiarity may have brought comfort. The same garment that irritated the skin also moved with the body in known ways. Poverty often forces intimacy with objects. Children experienced this world differently, but no less intensely. Their clothes were commonly passed down, altered, patched, and remade. A child might wear garments cut from older cloth, already softened by another life. Sleeves could be too long, hems let down as the child grew, patches added wherever play and work wore through. Children dirted clothing quickly, yet households could least afford constant replacement. The result was a practical tolerance for stains, repairs, and imperfect fit. A child's clothing showed not only poverty, but growth itself. Servants occupied another complicated position. Some servants wore clothing provided by their employers, especially in larger households. Livery could mark belonging to a lord or household, offering a kind of status and visibility. But it could also mark dependency. A servant's clothing had to reflect well on the household, which meant neatness could become part of obedience. The servant might possess little personal choice, yet be judged by appearance constantly. Their clothes were not only garments. They were signs of someone else's order. Among clergy and religious communities, clothing took on another form of discipline. Monastic habits were often designed to be plain, durable, and symbolic. The repeated wearing of simple clothing could express humility, obedience, and separation from luxury. But even here, garments had to be maintained. A habit could be patched. Linen could be washed. Rules could govern how many garments a monk or nun possessed, when they were issued, and how they were cared for. Religious simplicity did not remove material reality. It organized it under spiritual meaning. There is a quiet tension here between necessity and virtue. The poor might wear the same garment because they had no choice. The monk might wear plain clothing as a chosen discipline. The noble might wear the same expensive outer garment repeatedly because it was too valuable to wash casually. From the outside, all three might involve repeated wear. But the meaning was different in each case. Medieval clothing always requires us to ask not only what was worn, but why, by whom, and under what pressure. The pressure was especially visible in moments of transition. Weddings, funerals, church festivals, market days, legal appearances, seasonal fairs. These were times when clothing could lift someone slightly above ordinary life or expose how limited their household truly was. A family might borrow, alter, or carefully prepare clothing for such events. A bride's clothing, for instance, did not always resemble the modern white wedding dress. It depended on region, class, and means. The best available garment might be used, or a newly made item if the household could afford it. Clothing marked the seriousness of the moment. Funerals also reveal the value of cloth. The dead might be wrapped, dressed, or buried according to custom, status, and religious practice. Textiles could accompany the final passage, but cloth was valuable enough that choices mattered. The living needed garments too. In poorer households, the death of a person could leave behind clothing that became inheritance, charity, or practical survival for others. A cloak could outlive its owner. A shirt could be cut down. A belt could pass to another waist. The material world did not vanish with the person. It continued through use. The next layer, though, brings us even closer to daily life. What happened when clothing failed? Not when it looked unfashionable or smelled unpleasant, but when it tore at the wrong moment, wore thin before winter, became infested, shrank, rotted, or could no longer protect the body. In medieval Europe, the failure of clothing was not a small inconvenience. It could expose a person to cold, shame, sickness, debt, or dependence. And to understand that, we have to follow a garment beyond ordinary wear, into the slow and careful world of mending, remaking, selling, pawning, and rescuing every usable thread to follow that garment into the world of repair is to enter one of the quietest economies of medieval life. A torn sleeve was not simply a torn sleeve. It was a problem of warmth, decency, money, time, and skill. If the tear widened, the cloth might catch on tools or branches. If it opened near the shoulder, rain and cold could enter. If it appeared in a visible place, it could make the wearer look poorer than they wished to appear. So the tear had to be noticed early, handled patiently, and stopped before it turned one useful garment into a pile of scraps. Mending was often an ordinary household skill, not a special event. Needles, thread, scraps of cloth, and small acts of repair belonged to the daily maintenance of life. A patch might be placed where an elbow had thinned, where a knee had rubbed through, where a hem had frayed from mud, or where a shoulder had worn under the weight of a tool, sack, or strap. Some repairs were rough and purely practical. Others were surprisingly careful, especially when the garment still had to be worn in public. A neat patch could preserve dignity. A careless one could announce hardship. The thread used for repair mattered as well. It might be linen, wool, or whatever was available. A household did not always have perfectly matching material. A patch could be darker, lighter, coarser, or from another older garment entirely. To modern eyes, mismatched patches might seem comic or picturesque, but in medieval life they were part of survival. They showed how fabric moved through a household like a resource, never fully disappearing until it had lost every possible use. A worn-out adult garment could become clothing for a child. A damaged cloak could become a hood. A torn sheet could become underclothing. Old cloth could be cut into bands, wrappings, linings, patches, cleaning rags, or coverings. The life of textile material was rarely a straight line from new garment to waste. It was more like a slow descent through usefulness. Each stage was less prestigious than the one before, but still valuable. Even rags had work to do. This is why clothing failure could create anxiety long before the garment fully collapsed. A medieval person might look at a thinning sleeve and already understand the future problem. Winter was coming. Harvest had been poor. The family had debts. Wool was costly. Linen was limited. A garment that failed too soon could force choices no household wanted to make. Should money go toward cloth, rent, tools, seed, food, taxes, church dues, or an obligation to a lord? Clothing was essential, but it competed with every other necessity. For people near the edge of poverty, there was no clean separation between wardrobe and survival. A cloak was warmth on the road. Shoes were access to work. A hood was protection against rain. A decent garment could make someone acceptable at church, market, or service. To lose one was not like losing a fashion item. It could narrow a person's movement through the world. The poorer the household, the more each garment had to perform. Pawning clothing was one way people responded to pressure. In towns especially, garments could be pledged for money. A cloak, gown, belt, or piece of linen might be handed over temporarily in exchange for cash or credit. This tells us something very important about value. Clothes were not merely personal belongings. They were financial objects. They could be turned into money in a crisis. But pawning clothing also carried risk. If the owner could not repay, the garment might be lost. A person could solve one urgent problem and create another, colder one. The second-hand market helped many people clothe themselves, but it also carried uncertainty. A used garment might be cheaper than new cloth, but it came with its own history. It might already be worn thin, altered, patched, stained, or shaped by another body. It might fit poorly. It might need repair immediately. Still, for many buyers, second-hand clothing made the difference between having something serviceable and having nothing suitable at all. In urban streets and markets, old clothes moved from owner to owner, losing status perhaps, but not value. There was also a moral unease around used clothing, especially when it passed through suspicious hands. Stolen garments appeared in legal records because clothes were worth the risk of theft. A cloak could vanish from a tavern, a piece of linen from a household, a garment from a chest, or clothing from a traveler. Theft of clothes could be deeply disruptive because replacement was not easy. A stolen coat in winter was not only property crime. It was an attack on bodily safety and social dignity. To guard clothing, households used chests, locks when they could afford them, careful storage, and watchfulness. Servants might be responsible for garments belonging to masters. Travelers kept cloaks close. People recognized their own clothes by fabric, repairs, color, cut, and distinctive wear. A patch, stain, or altered seam might become identifying evidence. In a world of handmade goods, clothing had individual character. It was not anonymous. The making of new clothing, when possible, was not a casual purchase. Cloth itself was often the major expense. The cutting and sewing mattered, but the textile carried the greatest value. Wool and linen required such immense labor that even simple fabric represented accumulated time. This is why garments were often shaped with economy in mind. Cloth was cut carefully to reduce waste. Loose shapes, straight seams, and adjustable fits helped garments last longer and adapt to changing bodies. Belts, pins, laces, and simple tailoring allowed one piece of clothing to serve through weight changes, pregnancy, growth, or reuse by another person. Medieval fashion did change, sometimes dramatically among the upper classes, but most ordinary people could not afford to chase every style. Even so, they were not indifferent to fashion. A sleeve shape, hood style, shoe form, or garment length could carry meaning. The wealthy might display new cuts and expensive fabrics, while moralists complained about extravagance. Below them, townspeople and tradespeople might adopt modest versions of fashionable shapes when possible. The poor saw these changes too, but their garments were governed first by durability. Here again is a quiet contradiction. Clothing was supposed to place people visibly in society, yet clothing was always moving. A rich person's old garment could become a poorer person's better garment. A servant might wear cast-off clothing from a master. A child might wear cloth from a parent's old tunic. A market might sell garments whose former owners had died, fallen into debt, changed fashion, or simply needed money. The hierarchy of clothing was real, but it was not fixed in place. Fabric crossed boundaries even when society tried to keep people within them. This movement of clothing could create aspiration. A person might acquire a second-hand garment slightly better than their usual station. Perhaps the fabric was finer, the color stronger, the cut more elegant. Wearing it could bring pleasure, confidence, or suspicion. Did it look respectable or too ambitious? Did it make the wearer seem prosperous, or like someone pretending? In a society highly attentive to rank, clothing that crossed expectations could attract comment. A garment could improve a person's appearance and still make them vulnerable to judgment. Sumptuary concerns came from this anxiety. Authorities and moral writers often worried that clothing blurred social order. If merchants dressed like nobles, if servants wore finery, if women wore styles judged extravagant, if young men displayed excessive ornament, clothing seemed to threaten the readable structure of society. These anxieties were not constant everywhere, and rules varied, but they reveal how deeply appearance mattered. Clothes were a public text. People read them, argued over them, and tried to control what they said. For the person wearing the same clothes for weeks, though, the more immediate concern was not social theory. It was the daily calculation of wear. Which garment could be risked in the fields? Which one must be kept for Sunday? Which patch could wait? Which shoe needed repair before the road became muddy? Which child could inherit which piece next? Which garment could be pawned without leaving the household exposed? These were small decisions, but they formed the hidden architecture of household survival. Shoes deserve special attention because their failure could be especially serious. Medieval footwear varied by period, region, and class, but leather shoes were valuable, and poorer people might have limited pairs. Shoes wore down on rough ground. They absorbed water. They cracked, stretched, and needed repair. A person walking to fields, markets, church, mills, or neighboring villages depended on them. A torn tunic was embarrassing and uncomfortable. A failed shoe could slow work, injure the foot, or make winter movement painful. Repairing shoes required materials and skill. Cobblers and leatherworkers played important roles in towns and villages. Soles could be patched, uppers repaired, and old leather reused. But leather, like cloth, had limits. Wet conditions could ruin it. Poor fit could create blisters. A worker who owned only one pair might wear them until they were nearly destroyed. Barefoot labor was possible in some contexts and seasons, but not always safe or socially acceptable. Feet, like clothing, carried status. Belts were another small but important object. A belt held garments in place, carried tools, knives, pouches, keys, or small possessions, and helped shape the body's appearance. A simple belt could make a loose tunic practical. A finer belt could signal prosperity. Metal fittings could add value. Losing a belt might mean losing not only a clothing accessory, but a portable system for carrying daily life. In a world without pockets in the modern sense, what hung from the belt mattered. Fastenings also affected comfort. Pins, brooches, laces, points, hooks, buttons in later medieval contexts, and ties helped clothing adjust to the body. If one broke, the garment might become awkward or unusable. A cloak without a fastening had to be held. Hose that would not stay up could hinder movement. A loose garment could catch or expose. A tiny missing object could become a day-long frustration. Medieval clothing was full of such dependencies. The same was true of head coverings. A torn veil, missing cap, or damaged hood could affect not only warmth but public respectability. For women especially, depending on region and circumstance, appearing improperly covered could invite criticism. For men, hats and hoods could mark occupation, age, rank, or seasonal practicality. These items were easier to wash or replace than a full outer garment in some cases, but they still required care. They framed the face, and the face was what others encountered first. The household's textile labor often happened in fragments of time. A woman might mend by firelight after work, spin while watching children, patch clothing before a market day, or prepare linen for washing when weather looked favorable. Men in textile trades, tailors, fullers, dyers, weavers, and shoemakers contributed specialized skills. But inside the household, care was continuous. Clothing did not maintain itself. Every wearable garment represented repeated attention. Needles were small, but they were essential tools. A lost needle mattered. Thread had to be saved. Scraps were kept because they might become useful later. This habit of saving was not sentimental. It was rational. A household that threw away usable cloth would be wasting labor embodied in material. The medieval home, especially a poorer one, was often a place where nothing textile was casually discarded. This habit shaped the feel of clothing over time. A garment might have patches from different years, different cloths, different hands. One repair might be neat, another hurried. A sleeve might be older than the body of the tunic if pieces had been remade. A lining might come from another garment. The visible object was not always one original creation. It was an accumulation. It was to wear the history of repairs. For modern viewers, patched clothing often suggests poverty first. For medieval people, the meaning could be broader. A patched work garment was ordinary. A patched but clean and orderly garment could still be respectable. A heavily patched garment at a formal occasion might speak of hardship. A fine garment carefully repaired could show responsible stewardship. The question was not simply whether cloth was patched, but where, how, and in what setting it appeared. The wealthy also repaired clothing, though in different ways. Fine garments were too valuable to abandon after small damage. Skilled servants or professional tailors could mend, alter, reline, or refashion them. Fashionable clothing might be remade to suit a new style or wearer. Fur linings could be replaced. Decorative elements might be removed and reused. Gold thread, buttons, buckles, and ornaments had value beyond the garment. Elite wardrobes were not disposable either. They were managed with care precisely because they were expensive. But the wealthy had one great advantage. They could hide the labor of repair. Their garments might appear fresh because servants handled stains, storage, brushing, airing, and mending. A noble did not necessarily experience the anxiety of a peasant watching a sleeve fail before winter. Wealth could turn maintenance into invisible service. Poverty made maintenance visible on the body. There were also charitable systems that involved clothing. Giving garments to the poor could be an act of Christian charity. Monasteries, hospitals, wealthy households, guilds, and individuals might distribute clothing or cloth in certain circumstances. The naked, in religious language, were among those to be clothed as an act of mercy. But charity was uneven and often tied to moral judgment. The deserving poor might receive help. Others might be viewed with suspicion. Clothing charity could preserve life and dignity, but it could also reinforce dependence. For those on the margins, beggars, migrants, widows without support, disabled people, the elderly poor, clothing could become a visible plea. Ragged garments announced need. In cold weather, lack of clothing could be dangerous. To be poorly clothed was to be exposed twice, physically to the elements, socially to the gaze of others. The body without sufficient cloth became a public sign of vulnerability. Widows and widowers faced particular challenges depending on household resources. Clothing left by a spouse could be essential. A widow might inherit garments, bedding, or linen, but legal customs and family claims varied. If she had children, cloth had to be redistributed carefully. Mourning practices also affected clothing, especially among the better off, but for the poor, grief had to share space with practicality. The dead left behind fabric that the living needed. Illness added another layer of strain. A sick person might sweat through linen, soil bedding, or be unable to maintain clothing properly. Caregivers had to wash, air, or change what they could. In households with few textiles, illness could overwhelm the system. Clean linen was especially valuable in sickness, but not everyone had enough. The discomfort of wearing the same clothes could become sharper when the body was feverish, weak, or unable to move freely. Childbirth, too, placed demands on household textiles. Women needed cloth, bedding, coverings, and washable material at a moment when privacy, warmth, and bodily care mattered intensely. The same world that used cloth sparingly also needed it urgently for birth, sickness, menstruation, infancy, and death. Textiles were woven into the most vulnerable moments of life. This made their scarcity more than an economic inconvenience. It shaped the body's experience of being cared for. Workplaces had their own clothing risks. A blacksmith's clothing might be threatened by sparks, a cook's by grease and flame, a dyer's by stains, a tanner's by strong smells, a miller's by flour dust, a fisherman's by damp, a shepherd's by weather and animal contact, a baker's by heat and ash. Each occupation marked cloth differently. Some stains could be brushed away, Others became permanent. The garment became a record of labor, but also a boundary between the body and the work that might harm it. This occupational wear helps explain why aprons and oversleeves, where used, were practical protections. An apron could absorb the worst of a task while preserving the garment beneath. It could be washed or replaced more easily than a full tunic or gown. It also marked work visually. A person in an apron was not dressed for ceremony. They were dressed for labor. Yet that labor garment might be the reason the better garment survived. In agricultural life, clothing followed the year. Plowing, sowing, haymaking, harvest, threshing, winter repairs. Each season treated clothing differently. During harvest, garments might be pushed to their limit by sweat, dust, and long hours. During winter, they might be worn heavily and constantly for warmth. Spring mud could stain hems and shoes. Autumn damp could make drying difficult. Clothing care was not separate from the agricultural calendar. It rose and fell with work, weather, and daylight. Daylight itself mattered. Mending by dim light was difficult. Washing in short winter days took planning. Drying required sun, wind, or fire. A household could not simply decide that a garment should be washed whenever it was dirty. The environment had to cooperate. A long spell of rain could delay washing. Cold could freeze or stiffen cloth. A smoky fire could dry one problem into another. Medieval cleanliness was always negotiated with the sky. There is something deeply human in that negotiation. People wanted relief from discomfort. They wanted to look decent. They wanted to avoid shame. They wanted warmth. They wanted their children clothed. They wanted to stretch one more season out of a garment that was already tired. These desires are easy to understand. The difference lies in the narrowness of their options. The small economies of cloth also shaped relationships. A mother repairing a child's garment, a servant responsible for a master's wardrobe, a wife managing household linen, an apprentice receiving clothing from a master, a lord giving livery, a charity donor distributing old garments. All these acts carried power. Clothing could express care, obligation, dependency, discipline, generosity, or control. To give clothing was not always simple kindness. Sometimes it was authority made wearable. Livery is especially revealing. When a servant, retainer, or follower wore clothing associated with a household or lord, the garment marked belonging. It could protect the wearer by connecting them to power. It could also reduce personal identity beneath service. The cloth said, in effect, this person is attached to someone else. In a medieval world where protection and dependency were often intertwined, clothing could make social bonds visible at a distance. Guilds and urban regulations could also shape clothing. Apprentices, journeymen, masters, and civic officials moved through towns where appearance reflected order. A craftsperson's clothing had to be practical, but public occasions demanded better presentation. Processions, feast days, and religious observances could bring out garments reserved for collective identity. In those moments, clothing was not merely personal. It belonged to the town's visual life. Festival clothing provided release from the dullness of repeated wear. A better hood, a colorful belt, a cleaner shift, a freshly brushed cloak, or a carefully repaired gown could transform how a person felt for a day. Even modest improvement mattered. In a world where daily clothes were marked by work, special clothing created a temporary sense of dignity and participation. The garment might still be old, but it could be made ready. This is why the failure of special clothing could be painful. If the better garment became stained, torn, pawned, stolen, or outgrown, a household lost more than fabric. It lost the ability to appear properly at important moments. It lost a small reserve of pride. Everyday clothing could be rough because everyday life was rough. But feast day clothing carried hope. It allowed people to be seen differently, even briefly. For young people, clothing could also affect courtship and reputation. A young man without decent garments might struggle to present himself as capable. A young woman's clothing could be judged in relation to modesty, household care, and family status. Clothes did not determine marriage, but they contributed to impressions. A patched garment might be accepted if poverty was known, but neglect, disorder, or inappropriate display could damage reputation. The body was always being interpreted through cloth. This constant interpretation made clothing emotionally charged. It could shame, comfort, protect, elevate, or expose. Wearing the same clothes for weeks was not simply a physical inconvenience. It meant living inside an object that other people read. The garment carried your labor, your poverty, your household skill, your status, your discipline, and sometimes your misfortune. You did not just wear clothing. You wore evidence. And because clothing held evidence, people tried to manage what it revealed. A stain could be hidden beneath a cloak. A worn cuff could be turned. A damaged hem could be shortened. A faded garment could be dyed darker if resources allowed. A loose fit could be belted. A respectable head covering could draw attention upward. These were not acts of vanity alone. They were acts of social survival. Dyeing and re-dyeing were part of this world of transformation. Color could fade with wear, sun, washing, and time. Some dyes were expensive and prestigious. Others were more common. A dull garment might be refreshed, though dyeing required skill and materials. Darker colors could help conceal stains. Bright colors could signal wealth when they were strong and stable. But color was never just decoration. It was cost made visible. The poor often lived in more muted, practical tones not because medieval people lacked color, but because color required resources. The wealthy could display deep reds, rich blues, fine greens, and costly fabrics. Ordinary people might wear undyed wool, browns, grays, duller colors, or locally available dyes. Yet even modest color could bring pleasure. A hood with a pleasing shade, a belt with a small ornament, or a festival garment slightly brighter than daily wear could matter deeply. As garments aged, they lost not only strength but social meaning. A fine cloak could become ordinary. An ordinary tunic could become workwear. Workwear could become rags. Rags could become cleaning cloths. The descent was practical, but it could also be emotional. People watched valuable things become humble through use. The medieval household was accustomed to this slow decline, but that does not mean it was indifferent to it. The next step in the story leads us into the spaces where clothing was cleaned, transformed, and sometimes judged most intensely. The wash place, the riverbank, the courtyard, the town laundry, and the household fire. Because the question was never only how long someone wore the same clothes. It was also what happened on the rare, laborious days when those clothes were finally taken off, soaked, beaten, rinsed, dried, and returned to the body with whatever freshness medieval life could afford. Those rare, laborious days began long before a garment touched water. Someone first had to decide that the washing was worth the trouble. That decision depended on weather, work, household need, available fuel, the number of garments in reserve, and the condition of the cloth itself. A linen shirt could usually endure washing better than a heavy woolen tunic, but even linen required time and care. If rain was coming, if the house was short of firewood, if the wearer had no second garment, or if harvest work could not pause, the washing might be delayed again. Dirt was not always removed when it appeared. Often it was tolerated until the right moment arrived. When that moment did come, the work could be physically demanding. Water had to be carried or reached. In a rural village, this might mean going to a stream, pond, well, or communal washing place. In a town, it might mean a fountain, riverbank, courtyard, or shared water source. The journey itself mattered. Wet garments were heavy. Laundry was awkward to carry. A household with many textiles could turn washing into a major task, while a poor household might wash only a few crucial pieces. Linen shirts, shifts, baby cloths, head coverings, aprons, or bedding when absolutely necessary. The first stage was often soaking. Cloth that had absorbed sweat, smoke, body oils, dirt, and work stains could not simply be rinsed quickly and restored. It needed loosening. Water did some of the work, but water alone was rarely enough. Ash, lye, soap, fuller's earth, stale urine in certain textile processes, or other locally available cleaning agents might be used depending on place, period, material, and household means. The exact methods varied, but the principle was the same. Grease and dirt had to be broken down, lifted, or beaten out of the fibers. To modern ears, some of these cleaning materials sound worse than the dirt itself. But medieval washing was not organized around modern fragrance. It was organized around practical effect. Wood ash could create alkaline solutions. Alkalinity helped cut through grease. Urine, when fermented, produced ammonia and had value in fulling and certain cleaning processes. Soap, when available, could help, but it was not always the soft, scented domestic product modern people imagine. Medieval people were not trying to imitate a modern laundry room. They were using the chemistry their world offered. The labor was hard on hands. Cloth might be rubbed, twisted, stamped, beaten, or slapped against stones. A woman working at a riverbank might bend and lift repeatedly, her arms wet and cold, her back strained, her hands exposed to harsh water and alkaline substances. In winter, washing could be punishing. In summer, it could still be exhausting, especially if the laundry belonged not only to one person but to an entire household. Clean clothing came through bodily labor, and often through the labor of women whose work remained largely invisible unless it failed. This is one of the quiet injustices hidden inside the history of clothing. When a household appeared orderly, when linen was reasonably clean, when garments were mended and ready, the labor behind that order could disappear. But if clothing became too dirty, torn, or unpresentable, the failure was visible. The person responsible for household textiles, often a woman, could be judged for circumstances she did not fully control. Water, fuel, weather, poverty, sickness, pregnancy, childcare, harvest, and social obligations all pressed against the same work. Cleanliness required resources, but responsibility was often personal. The riverbank or washing place was also social. It could be a place of work, conversation, gossip, observation, and judgment. Clothing carried private evidence into a public setting. Stains, worn linen, bedding, children's cloths, and undergarments revealed things about a household's condition. The quality of fabric, the number of items washed, the degree of wear, and the urgency of the washing could all be noticed. Laundry was intimate, but it was not always private. In some towns, professional laundresses took on this labor for those who could pay. Their work was essential and often physically demanding. They handled other people's dirt, linen, bedding, and clothing, managing what wealthier households wished to have cleaned without doing the work themselves. The presence of laundresses reminds us again that cleanliness was partly classed. The wealthy could distance themselves from the hardest parts of washing. The poor washed for themselves or sometimes washed for others. But even professional laundering had limits. Fine garments could not always be treated harshly. Woolens, dyed fabrics, lined garments, fur-trimmed clothing, and delicate textiles required caution. Too much soaking could damage shape. Heat could shrink. Strong agents could affect color. Embroidery, decoration, and seams could suffer. The more valuable the garment, the more careful the cleaning had to be. Sometimes the safest approach was not washing at all, but airing, brushing, spot cleaning, scenting, or storing carefully. This creates a strange reversal. The clothing closest to dirt and labor sometimes had to be washed most urgently, but the clothing most visible and prestigious could be the least washable. A noble robe might be carefully protected from ordinary dirt, not because nobles loved dirt, but because the garment was too valuable and too complex to treat casually. A poor person's linen shirt might be scrubbed hard because it had to be made bearable, even if repeated washing wore it out. Cleanliness and preservation were always in tension. After washing came rinsing, and rinsing required more water. If the cleaning agent remained in the cloth, it could irritate the skin or stiffen the fabric. Rinsing in a river or stream might seem straightforward, but urban waterways were often used for many things at once. People washed clothes, animals drank, trades discharged waste, households emptied refuse, and communities depended on the same waters in overlapping ways. Medieval towns attempted regulation at times, especially around trades that fouled water, but enforcement was uneven. Clean water was precious partly because it was so easily compromised. The washed garment then had to be wrung, spread, hung, or laid out to dry. Drying may sound passive, but it was one of the most uncertain stages. A light linen garment could dry fairly well in good weather. Heavy wool could take much longer. In damp climates or rainy seasons, drying might be slow and frustrating. A garment left too long in damp conditions could smell musty. If dried too close to smoke, it could absorb the smell of the fire again. If hung outside, it could be dirted by wind, animals, children, or accident. If left unguarded, it might even be stolen. Sun and wind were allies, but not reliable servants. The same household that waited days for suitable washing weather might then watch clouds gather before the laundry dried. In winter, drying indoors filled living spaces with moisture. Cloth near the hearth might steam and smoke. A household could become crowded with hanging linen, damp wool, and the smell of wet fibers. What modern washing machines and dryers hide from us is the amount of space laundry once required. Cleanliness needed air. For people who owned few garments, drying created a particularly uncomfortable gap. A person might wait in older clothing, in a borrowed garment, in bedding, or simply avoid public activity while a crucial item dried. The phrase wash day could mean more than labor. It could mean temporary vulnerability. What could be washed depended on what could be spared. No household wanted a working adult left without usable clothing when animals needed feeding, fields needed tending, or market obligations remained. When clothes finally dried, they did not return as modern softness. Linen might feel stiff if dried in certain ways. Wool could regain shape imperfectly. Harsh cleaning might make cloth rougher. A garment could smell fresher than before, but still carry smoke, water, herbs, ash, or outdoor air. Freshness was relative. The first feeling of a newly washed linen shift against the skin might be deeply pleasant, especially after days or weeks of wear. But that comfort would be brief. The body, the house, and the workday would soon begin marking it again. This cycle shaped how people thought about underclothing. A clean linen garment was valuable not because it stayed clean forever, but because it offered a temporary reset. It absorbed what the body released, protected the outer garment. It gave a person a sense of renewed order. In religious and medical thinking, clean linen could carry meanings of decency, health, and bodily management. In practical life, it could simply feel better. For a person who had worn the same layer too long, the relief of clean linen may have been one of the small comforts that made hardship more bearable. Outer garments, meanwhile, often received a different kind of care. Wool could be brushed after drying mud had hardened. Smoke could be reduced by airing. Small stains could be treated locally. Folds could be shaken out. A garment might be beaten gently to remove dust. If the cloth was thick or fulled, dirt might not penetrate deeply, making surface cleaning useful. Wool also has qualities that can resist some dirt and odor better than many modern people expect, though that did not make it magically clean. It meant that medieval care was material-specific. People learned what each fabric could tolerate. The care of wool was especially important because wool was central to medieval European economies. Sheep, pasture, spinning, weaving, dyeing, fulling, and trade connected rural labor to urban wealth. In regions like England and Flanders, wool and cloth became major sources of prosperity and political concern. The garment on a laborer's body was part of a much larger system of land, animals, taxes, merchants, guilds, and international trade. A humble tunic might seem ordinary, but the material world behind it was enormous. This larger system did not necessarily make clothing easier for the poor to obtain. In fact, commercial textile production could create wealth for some while still leaving many households careful with every scrap. Cloth could be exported, taxed, regulated, and priced beyond the easy reach of the people whose labor helped produce it. The medieval clothing economy was not simply local self-sufficiency. It was often tied to markets, power, and inequality. In towns where cloth production flourished, streets could be shaped by textile labor. Weavers worked looms. Fullers processed cloth. Dyers handled vats of color and strong smells. Shearers finished surfaces. Tailors cut and sewed garments. Merchants moved cloth from one place to another. Each stage added value. Each stage also made clothing more specialized. By the later Middle Ages, many towns had complex textile trades, and the garment worn for weeks by an ordinary person was connected to professional skills they might never fully see. Dyeing, in particular, complicates the story of washing. Color was beautiful, but it could be unstable. Some dyes faded. Some reacted poorly to washing. Some colors were expensive because the materials or processes were difficult. A garment dyed with care might be treated cautiously to preserve its appearance. Repeated washing could dull it. Sun could change it. Sweat could affect it. This meant that the desire to clean clothing could conflict with the desire to keep it visually respectable. The poor often relied on less costly colors or undyed cloth, but that did not mean their clothing was always plain in the imagination of the period. Medieval Europe was visually rich. Markets, churches, festivals, manuscripts, painted walls, banners, and noble clothing all displayed color. Ordinary people lived within that visual culture even if their own garments were modest. A small colored hood, a dyed belt, or a brighter Sunday garment could carry emotional force. Washing such an item too harshly was not only material risk, could dull a rare pleasure. There were also smells connected to textile trades. Fulling, tanning, dyeing, and laundering could create odors that modern people might find strong or offensive. Medieval towns often organized certain trades in particular areas partly because of smell, water needs, and waste. Clothing therefore passed through processes that were themselves messy before it ever became a sign of cleanliness or status. A fine garment might begin in mud, sweat, animal grease, urine, dye vats, and hard labor before appearing in a hall or church as evidence of refinement. That contradiction is central to medieval material culture. Beauty often came from unpleasant work. Soft cloth came from rough hands. Bright color came from vats, mordants, plants, minerals, insects, and trade. Clean linen came from cold water and aching arms. A noble's elegant sleeve concealed the labor of shepherds, spinners, weavers, dyers, tailors, servants, and laundresses. The more polished the surface, the more invisible the work beneath it became. For most people, however, clothing care stayed close to the body and the household. The washed shirt, the brushed tunic, the patched hose, the dried cloak, these objects returned to daily use. They were not museum pieces. They were worn into fields, kitchens, workshops, churches, lanes, and beds. Almost immediately, they began collecting life again. A sleeve darkened at the cuff. A hem touched mud. Smoke entered the fibers. A child's hand pulled at the cloth. A belt creased the waist. The garment resumed its slow transformation from clean enough to worn again. This rhythm could make medieval people practical rather than sentimental. A garment did not need to be spotless to be useful. It needed to be sound. It needed to cover, warm, protect, and present the wearer appropriately enough for the situation. Cleanliness was desirable, but durability was essential. A perfectly clean garment that tore too easily was a problem. A slightly smoky cloak that kept out cold was a blessing. The phrase "same clothes for weeks" therefore covers many different degrees of care. Someone might wear the same woolen outer garment for weeks while changing linen underneath. Someone else might wear the same entire set because they owned little else. A noble might reappear in the same impressive garment at several formal occasions, carefully brushed and stored between uses. A laborer might wear a tunic continuously through days of work, sleep, smoke, and weather. The visible repetition could look similar from far away, but the lived experience differed sharply. We should also remember that medieval clothing did not always fit the modern idea of individual ownership. Households shared, reassigned, and redistributed garments. A cloak might be used by more than one person in different contexts. Children inherited. Servants received. The sick were covered with whatever was available. Bedding and clothing overlapped. A piece of cloth could move from body to body, bed to body, storage to market, market to pawn shop to new owner. The life of fabric was mobile. This mobility could spread more than warmth. Lice, fleas, and other pests could travel in clothing and bedding. Second-hand clothing, shared beds, crowded households, and infrequent washing all increased the challenge. People understood infestation as a nuisance and sometimes as a sign of poverty or disorder, though it crossed class boundaries more than elites might have wished to admit. Fine clothing could hide pests too, especially in seams and linings. Wealth provided more means to manage the problem, not immunity from it. The seams of clothing were especially troublesome. They were places where fabric folded, dirt collected, and insects could hide. A person scratching at a seam was not necessarily careless. They might be dealing with a common irritation of the age. Combing, picking, shaking, washing linen, airing bedding, and changing garments when possible were all ways to respond. But total control was difficult without the modern combination of hot washing, chemical treatment, sealed storage, and abundant replacement textiles. Bedding made the clothing problem worse. A person could put on a cleaner garment and then sleep in bedding that was smoky, shared, old, straw-filled, or pest-prone. Straw mattresses had to be refreshed. Blankets and covers needed airing. In crowded homes, several people might sleep close together. Night did not free the body from the material environment. It placed the body deeper inside it. Clothing, bedding, skin, and household air formed one continuous world. This also means that the modern division between personal hygiene and household hygiene does not fit perfectly. A medieval person's clothes were shaped by the whole house. If the floor was damp, the hem suffered. If the fire smoked, the cloak smelled. If bedding held insects, the shirt might too. If animals were nearby, dirt and smell followed. Clean clothing was fragile because the environment was never neutral. Yet people still created moments of order. Before church, someone might put on a cleaner head covering, brush a cloak, fasten a belt, and choose the least worn shoes. Before a market visit, a trader might select clothing that suggested reliability. Before a festival, a family might bring out stored garments and shake away the smell of the chest. These preparations mattered because they created a temporary boundary between ordinary dirt and public life. Church was especially important in this boundary making. Medieval churches gathered communities in shared space. People came not only to worship but to be seen. Clothing there could signal respect toward God, the saints, and the community. Even those who owned little might try to appear as orderly as possible. A person could not always be finely dressed, but visible care mattered. The same garment worn during the week might be adjusted, cleaned as best as possible, and made acceptable for Sunday. At the same time, religious teaching could complicate pride in clothing. Sermons and moral writings often warned against vanity, luxury, and excessive display. Fine dress might be admired socially and criticized spiritually. The poor could be judged for raggedness, while the rich could be criticized for extravagance. Clothing placed everyone under scrutiny, though not equally. The poor were exposed by lack. The wealthy were exposed by abundance. This moral tension helped shape the emotional world of dress. A person wanted to look respectable but not presumptuous, modest but not degraded, clean but not vain, properly ranked but not shamefully poor. For women, these pressures could be particularly intense because clothing, hair covering, modesty, household management, and sexual reputation often intersected. For men, clothing could signal competence, trade, honor, household authority, or failure to provide. Everyone's body was clothed in expectation. The washing place, then, was not only about removing dirt. It was where material life, gendered labor, class difference, bodily discomfort, and public respectability met. A damp shirt beaten against stone carried more than sweat. It carried the household's need to remain socially legible. It carried the hope that a person could step back into public life looking managed, not abandoned. The water did not create modern cleanliness, but it restored a measure of order. And that order was never permanent. The freshly dried garment returned to the same world that had dirted it before. A worker stepped out into mud. A cook leaned over smoke. A child sat on the ground. A traveler entered rain. A servant hurried through a courtyard. A villager crossed a field in wet grass. The cycle began again, not as failure, but as the normal rhythm of medieval life. There is something revealing in that rhythm. Medieval clothing was not maintained because people expected perfection. It was maintained because life constantly threatened to pull things apart. Washing, mending, airing, brushing, folding, storing, and patching were small acts of resistance against decay. Every household, rich or poor, lived with decay. Wealth slowed it. Labor answered it. Poverty made it more visible. As we continue deeper, the next question becomes less about the clothes themselves and more about the people inside them. Because wearing the same garments for weeks affected not only comfort and appearance, but the way people moved, worked, slept, prayed, traveled, courted, served, and understood their own bodies. To see that clearly, we have to follow a medieval person through an ordinary day, from the first cold moment of dressing before dawn to the last smoky hour before sleep. The first cold moment of dressing before dawn was often not a clean beginning, but a return to what the body had left behind the night before. In a small house, before the fire was fully alive, clothing might be reached for in darkness or gray morning light. A linen shirt or shift, if it had been slept in, was already warm from the body but not fresh. If it had been set aside, it could feel cold, stiff, and slightly damp from the air. Woolen layers might smell faintly of smoke, animals, old sweat, dried earth, and the enclosed room. To dress was not to become newly made. It was to re-enter the working world through familiar cloth. For many ordinary people, the morning did not begin with choosing an outfit. It began with putting back on the garments that made work possible. A tunic, gown, hose, belt, hood, shoes, Apron or cloak were not separate expressions of mood. They were tools. The body learned them by habit. The hands found the worn places. The belt settled into its usual crease. The shoulder knew where the fabric pulled. The foot entered a shoe shaped by previous miles. Even discomfort became predictable, and predictability had its own value. Before the day's public life began, small adjustments could make a difference. A person might smooth the front of a tunic, pull a sleeve into place, tie or fasten hose, tighten a belt, tuck hair under a cap or veil, shake dust from a cloak, or check a patch that had been threatening to come loose. These gestures were quick, but they mattered. They were the difference between looking merely poor and looking neglected. In a world where clothing was worn repeatedly, order came not from novelty, but from arrangement. If the household had a fire, smoke began its work almost immediately. Medieval interiors often carried the scent of the hearth into everything. A person might dress in clothing already smoky, then spend the first hour of the day feeding the same source of smell. The fire cooked food, warmed hands, dried damp cloth, and filled the roof space with fumes. Smoke irritated eyes and throats, darkened rafters, and clung to wool. It also helped mask other odors, which may be one reason the medieval smellscape was so layered. Smoke was not merely unpleasant. It was domestic. It meant warmth, food, survival, and the stubborn mark of home. The first tasks of the morning depended on season and status. In a rural household, animals might need attention before people ate. Chickens, pigs, sheep, cattle, or horses brought their own smells and dirt. Feeding, milking, mucking, carrying water, or opening a byre could mark clothing before the sun fully rose. A clean hem did not remain clean long near straw, dung, mud, and wet ground. Shoes could darken. Wool could brush against animals. An apron might catch splashes and fragments. The body moved through a world that touched it constantly. For a field worker, clothing had to prepare the body for exposure. In spring, damp soil could cling to footwear and hems. In summer, dust and sweat worked into cloth. In autumn, harvest roughened sleeves and shoulders. In winter, every layer mattered. The same tunic worn day after day became part of the laboring body. It did not simply cover movement. It absorbed it. When a worker bent, lifted, pulled, carried, or knelt, the garment strained in repeated places. Over time, clothing revealed the shape of labor as clearly as hands did. The belt was especially important through the workday. It gathered loose fabric so the wearer could move, and it carried the small objects that made daily life manageable. A knife, pouch, keys, cord, tool, or purse might hang from it. Tightening the belt before work could feel like preparing for the day's burden. Loosening it later might be one of the few moments of relief. The belt turned clothing from draped fabric into equipment. For women in many households, an apron or overskirt could protect the main garment during work. This protective layer might become dirtier than the clothing beneath, which was exactly its purpose. Caught flour, ash, grease, mud, milk, dye, straw, or childcare messes. It could be washed or replaced more easily than the garment it shielded, though more easily did not mean easily in any modern sense. The apron was a quiet strategy. Let one piece suffer so another survived. In kitchens, clothing met heat and grease. A woman or servant leaning over a fire risked sparks, smoke, stains, and sweat. Sleeves had to be managed carefully. Loose fabric near flame was dangerous. Hair coverings helped protect hair from ash and soot. The smell of cooking entered clothing quickly, especially in enclosed spaces. Bread, pottage, onions, ale, smoke, fat, and damp would all had a way of becoming part of the fabric. A person who cooked did not merely prepare food. They wore the kitchen afterward. In workshops, clothing changed according to trade. A blacksmith's garments might carry soot and tiny burns. A baker's could whiten with flour. A dyer's hands and sleeves might show color that no washing fully removed. A tanner's clothing could carry strong smells from hides and the processes used to treat them. A carpenter's garments caught sawdust and splinters. A miller's clothing, famously, could be marked by flour, making the body appear pale and dusty. Each occupation had a textile signature, and those signatures told the town what kind of work had shaped the person. This could be practical but also social. Work dirt was more acceptable when it matched the work. A fisherman smelling of water and fish, a shepherd smelling of sheep and lanolin, or a cook smelling of smoke and fat made sense. But to carry the wrong kind of dirt into the wrong setting could be embarrassing. Medieval people understood context. They did not demand impossible cleanliness from hard labor, but they recognized when a person had failed to make the transition from work to public respect. That transition might happen before church, market, or a visit to a lord's hall. A person could not always change completely, but they might remove the dirtiest apron, brush the tunic, rinse hands and face, adjust the head covering, and put on a cloak or hood that looked more presentable. The transformation could be small but meaningful. Modern viewers often underestimate how much dignity can be made from arrangement. A garment did not have to be new to be made ready. For servants, the daily experience of clothing was shaped by scrutiny. A servant in a large household might rise early, dress quickly, and begin work before the household superiors were fully visible. Their clothing had to allow labor but also reflect the order of the house. If provided with livery or specific garments, they wore a sign of belonging that was also a sign of control. A stained or disordered appearance could be taken as disrespect, laziness, or incompetence, even if the work itself had caused the stain. Servants also handled the clothing of others. They brushed, folded, stored, carried, warmed, aired, or arranged garments that might be far finer than anything they owned. This contrast must have been impossible to miss. A maid responsible for linen might wash and handle fabric softer and whiter than her own. A valet or attendant might help a lord dress in layered garments, fastenings, and accessories that required another pair of hands. Clothing, in such moments, became a daily lesson in hierarchy. Some bodies were served, others served through cloth. For the wealthy, dressing could be a more elaborate process, but not necessarily a cleaner one in the modern sense. Fine clothing involved layers, fastenings, fitted shapes, linings, and accessories. A person of rank might wear fresh linen beneath outer garments that had been carefully stored rather than washed. Their experience of repeated clothing was buffered by servants and surplus. They could change underlayers more often. They could own multiple gowns, robes, hose, shirts, caps, and cloaks. But they still lived in a world of smoke, uncertain water, animal smells, crowded halls, and limited methods of cleaning expensive outerwear. The noble body was therefore not modernly fresh. It was managed. It was wrapped in status, aired by servants, scented when possible, shielded by linen, and displayed through fabrics that signaled power. A robe could be worn more than once, perhaps many times, yet appear impressive because it was brushed, folded, stored, and protected. Repetition did not weaken status if the garment itself was valuable and appropriate. Among the wealthy, the question was less, "Have I worn this before?" and more, "What does this garment say, and is it suitable for this moment?" The poor faced a different question. Can this garment survive the day? A laborer might feel a seam give slightly while lifting a load. A woman might notice a hem dragging into mud. A child might tear a sleeve while playing or working. A traveler might feel a shoe beginning to split. These small failures created immediate calculations. Could it be ignored until evening? Could it be tied, pinned, or tucked? Would it become worse if left alone? Was there thread at home? Was there spare cloth? Would the repair show? During the day, the body's own needs also tested clothing. Sweat collected under arms, along the back, and beneath belts. Linen absorbed it first if linen was worn. Wool held warmth and smell. In cold weather, sweat could become dangerous when work stopped, chilling the body inside damp layers. In hot weather, clothing could feel heavy and close. The medieval body was rarely in a perfectly controlled climate. It moved between fire and frost, sun and shade, rain and indoor smoke, exertion and stillness. Clothing had to manage all of it imperfectly. Insects added another constant irritation. A person might feel a bite or crawling sensation while working, praying, walking, or lying down at night. Scratching was common enough that it belonged to the background of life, though too much visible scratching could still embarrass. Seams, hair, bedding, and layered clothing created hiding places. The more often garments were worn, the more carefully they had to be shaken, aired, searched, or washed when possible. But pest control was not a single event. It was a continuing struggle. For children, the ordinary day in worn clothing could be even rougher. Children sat on the ground, ran through mud, helped with small tasks, tended animals, carried things, and grew faster than cloth could comfortably keep up. Their garments might be shortened, lengthened, patched, and altered repeatedly. A child might wear clothing too large because it had been made to last, or too small because the household could not replace it yet. The body grew against the economy. This growth made children's clothing a constant challenge. Letting out seams, lowering hems, rolling sleeves, tying loose fabric, or cutting down older garments were practical solutions. But children also wore evidence of family resources very visibly. A better-off child could appear cleaner and more carefully fitted. A poorer child might show repair on repair. Yet childhood itself allowed some tolerance. Dirt on a child could be ordinary, but beyond a certain point it reflected on the household. Again, clothing became social judgment. At midday, clothing might be loosened during rest or adjusted for comfort. A worker might remove a hood, push up sleeves, shake out a garment, or sit where sun could dry damp fabric. Food eaten during work could stain clothing further. Breadcrumbs, pottage splashes, ale, cheese, grease, or fruit could leave marks. Hands wiped on aprons or tunics added another layer of use. In a world without disposable napkins for the poor, clothing and small cloths absorbed the messes of eating as well as labor. The sounds of clothing also belonged to the day. Wool brushing against wool, leather creaking, a belt buckle shifting, a cloak dragging lightly, wooden pattens or shoes striking the ground, the rustle of linen beneath heavier layers. Clothing was sensory in more than smell and touch. It made the body audible. In a quiet church or hall, the movement of garments could mark rank and presence. Fine fabrics moved differently from coarse ones. Metal fittings, jewelry, or decorated belts could announce wealth before a word was spoken. In church, the body's clothing was disciplined by stillness. A person who had been laboring might kneel or stand in garments carrying the week's work. The warmth of bodies gathered together, the smell of wax, incense in some settings, damp wool, wet cloaks, and human breath would mingle in the church air. Cleanliness here was not absolute. It was ceremonial effort. People presented themselves as best they could before God and community. A cleaned face, covered head, fastened garment, and reserved cloak could matter more than perfect freshness. For the wealthy entering church, clothing could become spiritually ambiguous. Rich fabrics honored the occasion and displayed rank, but they could also invite criticism of pride. For the poor, inadequate clothing could be humbling in a more literal way. The shared religious space did not erase social difference. It made it visible under sacred light. A noble's fur lining and a peasant's patched tunic existed within the same spiritual order, but not within the same material reality. Market life made clothing even more publicly readable. In a market, a person might be judged by strangers. Buyers assessed sellers. Sellers assessed buyers. Credit, trust, bargaining, and reputation all moved through appearance. A trader who looked too ragged might seem unreliable. A buyer who looked prosperous might be charged differently. A servant in livery might be treated according to the status of the household represented. Clothing could affect transactions before speech began. The market also tempted people with cloth itself. Stalls, merchants, second-hand sellers, ribbons, belts, shoes, caps, and fabrics brought the possibility of replacement or improvement into view. A person might handle cloth they could not afford, study used garments for value, compare colors, examine wear, or imagine what a better piece might do for their public life. Medieval shopping, where available, was not simply consumption. It was calculation under constraint. For apprentices and young workers in towns, clothing could be particularly important. They were old enough to be seen as social actors but not fully established. Their garments reflected their master, trade, and prospects. A young man hoping to advance needed to appear competent. A young woman in service needed to appear modest, orderly, and diligent. Clothing could not guarantee advancement, but poor presentation could hinder it. Repeated wear therefore had to be managed carefully, especially by those trying to move upward or avoid falling downward. As evening approached, the body returned home with the day written onto it. The clothing that had begun the morning smoky and worn might now be damp at the hem, dusted at the sleeve, stained at the front, stretched at the knees, or warm with sweat beneath the arms. If the day had been rainy, the garment might feel heavy. If cold, it might be stiff. If hot, it might cling. The wearer might be aware of smell more strongly indoors once movement stopped. Fatigue makes discomfort louder. Evening did not necessarily bring undressing in the modern sense. In poorer households, people might sleep in some of their clothing, especially in cold weather or where bedding was limited. They might remove shoes, belt, outer cloak, or headgear, but keep underclothing or even parts of daywear on for warmth. The boundary between the clothed day and the clothed night could be thin. A garment worn for work might become part of sleep, then return to work again after dawn. This is one of the hardest things for modern viewers to imagine. We associate sleep with softness, privacy, and clothing designed specifically for rest. Many medieval people slept in conditions where privacy was limited, warmth uncertain, and bedding shared. The same shirt that had absorbed the day's labor might lie against the skin at night. The same cloak that faced rain might serve as a blanket. The same smoke that filled the house during cooking might settle into bedding while people slept. Removing clothing could also mean exposing the body to cold, insects, or the eyes of others in a crowded household. Modesty did not vanish at night. Families, servants, travelers, and lodgers might sleep in shared spaces. Clothing helped preserve privacy where architecture did not. To remain partly dressed was practical, warm, and socially protective. Comfort was only one part of the decision. Before sleep, some care might still happen. Shoes could be set near the fire to dry, though not too close if one wanted to avoid damage. A damp cloak could be hung. A belt might be unfastened and placed where it would not be lost. A head covering might be folded. A torn place might be noticed with a sigh and left for repair when light returned. If someone had the strength, a small patch might be made by firelight. If not, the garment would carry the problem into the next day. Firelight changed clothing visually. Rough cloth softened in shadow. Patches became less obvious. Smoke rose. People sat close together. A tunic that looked poor in the market might simply look ordinary beside the hearth. The household space allowed some relief from public judgment, though not from discomfort. Here the garment was not performing rank quite so intensely. It was keeping the body warm until morning. But even at home, clothing still structured relationships. A father's cloak might be hung where children knew not to touch it. A mother's better garment might be stored away carefully. A servant's clothing might remain separate from a master's. A child might be told not to dirty the one decent piece reserved for church. A repaired garment might be inspected. A missing item might cause alarm. Textiles organize space, memory, authority, and care. The smell of evening clothing was the smell of the day gathered together. Smoke, animals, sweat, food, mud, damp wool, leather, and straw all returned indoors. This is not to say every home was equally unpleasant or that people never found comfort there. Familiar smells can become part of belonging. The scent of one's own hearth, wool cloak, stored linen, or wooden chest might feel reassuring. But familiarity did not erase hardship. It made hardship livable. There is a quiet emotional realism in this ordinary day. Medieval people were not constantly horrified by their clothing, nor were they magically immune to discomfort. They inhabited a middle world of tolerance, effort, irritation, pride, and necessity. They noticed when cloth was too dirty. They valued fresh linen. They disliked vermin. They saved better garments. They patched what tore. They endured what could not yet be fixed. The same clothes worn for weeks were part of a life that made endurance ordinary. This daily rhythm also shaped how people understood the body. The body was not separated from work, weather, and household in the way modern comfort often encourages. The body was porous to the world. Cold entered through damp sleeves. Smoke lived in hair. Mud marked hems. Labor stiffened cloth. Illness demanded linen. Heat and sweat changed how a garment felt hour by hour. Clothing was the boundary between self and world, but it was a boundary that constantly absorbed the world. For the wealthy, that boundary could be layered, perfumed, lined, and serviced. For the poor, it was thinner, rougher, and more visibly strained. But everyone, in some way, lived through textiles. Even kings and bishops depended on cloth and the labor behind it. Even peasants used clothing to signal dignity. Even monks who renounced luxury still needed habits, hoods, bedding, and repair. No one escaped the material problem. They only occupied different positions within it. By following one ordinary day, we can see why wearing the same clothes for weeks was not an isolated fact, but a pattern woven through medieval life. The morning began in familiar cloth. Work marked it. Public life judged it. Weather challenged it. Evening returned it to the smoky interior. Night folded it into sleep. Then dawn asked it to begin again. Yet an ordinary day was only one scale of the story. Medieval clothing also changed with the great disruptions of life. Famine, plague, war, migration, bad harvests, rising wages, urban growth, religious reform, and the slow shifts of fashion and trade. In those moments, the same old garments could become signs of crisis, opportunity, fear, or transformation. And to understand how deeply clothing mattered, we have to move from the single day to the larger historical forces that could suddenly make a shirt, a cloak, or a pair of shoes more valuable than almost anything else a household owned. Those larger forces could turn clothing from ordinary necessity into a visible measure of survival. In years of scarcity, when harvests failed or prices rose, a garment might be stretched far beyond what the household had intended. A cloak that should have been replaced might be patched again. Shoes that should have gone to a cobbler might be worn until the leather barely held. Linen might be washed less often, not because people stopped caring, but because time, fuel, money, and strength were being pulled toward food. In hard years, the body became a ledger, and clothing showed what the household could no longer afford to hide. Famine made this especially cruel. When food became scarce, everything else became negotiable. Clothes could be sold, pawned, traded, or worn thin while money went toward grain. A family might part with a better garment to buy bread, knowing that the decision would return later as cold, shame, or lost respectability. The choice was not between comfort and elegance. It was often between warmth and hunger, between keeping a cloak and keeping a child fed, between preserving dignity today and surviving until next week. In such moments, the value of clothing became painfully clear. A medieval household might own very little that could be converted quickly into money. Tools mattered, but losing them could destroy future work. Animals mattered, but selling them could weaken the household for years. Clothing, especially better clothing, was portable wealth. It could be carried, hidden, pawned, stolen, inherited, or given away. But it was also intimate wealth. To lose it was to lose part of the body's defense against the world. War created another kind of pressure. Armies moving through land could take food, animals, carts, tools, and clothing. Soldiers needed garments, shoes, belts, blankets, and cloaks just as much as weapons. Civilians caught in conflict might flee with only what they could wear or carry. In such conditions, wearing the same clothes for weeks was no longer just ordinary thrift. It could become the mark of displacement. A cloak became bedding. A spare shirt became impossible luxury. Shoes became the difference between movement and helplessness. Even those not directly fighting felt the strain. Taxes, requisitions, disrupted trade, and insecurity could make cloth harder to obtain. Roads became unsafe. Markets weakened. Craftspeople lost customers or materials. A household that might once have replaced a garment in a better year now had to repair, reuse, and endure. The clothing economy was never separate from political life. When lords fought, when towns were taxed, when roads were dangerous, when trade slowed, the effects could eventually reach the sleeve of a peasant's tunic or the sole of a traveler's shoe. Plague and disease changed clothing in quieter but profound ways. During periods of severe mortality, garments passed rapidly from the dead to the living, from households into markets, from abandoned spaces into new hands. Clothing could become inheritance, necessity, suspicion, or fear. People did not always understand disease in modern biological terms, but they often feared contaminated air, corrupted matter, and objects associated with sickness. A garment left behind by the dead might be valuable and unsettling at the same time. Here, the medieval relationship with clothing became emotionally complicated. Cloth was too valuable to waste, but it was also close to the body. It held sweat, smell, bedding, illness, memory, and loss. To reuse a garment could be practical, even necessary. Yet the wearer might know whose body had shaped it before. A cloak could warm one person while carrying the absence of another. In a world where death could enter the household suddenly, clothing became one of the ways the living handled what remained. After the great disruptions of the later Middle Ages, especially in places affected by labor shortages after plague, clothing could also become a sign of changing social confidence. In some regions, workers demanded higher wages, moved for better opportunities, or used improved earnings to buy better food and clothing. Authorities sometimes complained that people of lower status were dressing above their rank. Whether those complaints were exaggerated or not, they reveal a real anxiety. Clothing was not just covering bodies. It was revealing social movement. This is one reason sumptuary laws and moral criticism matter so much. They show that clothing could disturb the imagination of hierarchy. A servant in finer cloth, a prosperous artisan in fashionable dress, a merchant's wife wearing costly fabric, or young workers displaying ornament could all seem to blur the lines that elites wanted clear. The same society that forced the poor to wear clothes for too long could become alarmed when some of them began to dress too well. That contradiction is deeply medieval, but not only medieval. Fashion itself kept changing. Sleeves lengthened or narrowed. Hoods developed elaborate forms. Shoes became pointed in certain periods. Gowns changed in cut and fit. Buttons, lacing, tailoring, and layered silhouettes altered how garments sat on the body. These changes were most visible among elites and urban groups, but they shaped the broader visual world. Even if a poor villager could not afford the newest style, they lived in a culture where clothing carried time. An old garment was not only worn, it could become visibly old-fashioned. That added another pressure to repeated wear. A garment could fail physically, socially, or stylistically. It could still cover the body and yet no longer say what the wearer wished it to say. For the poor, this mattered less than warmth and durability, but it did not matter not at all. People wanted to belong to their moment. A hood, sleeve, belt, or shoe might be adjusted to keep pace modestly with change. Clothing allowed people to participate in the world's appearance, even when they did so with altered second-hand cloth and careful repair. In the later medieval town, this visual world grew more complex. Markets offered more goods. Tailors and textile workers specialized. Imported fabrics appeared beside local cloth. Second-hand clothing circulated through dense networks. Urban people saw more variety, and variety sharpened comparison. One person's patched gown stood beside another's newly dyed cloak. A servant's livery passed a merchant's fur lining. A pilgrim's worn clothes crossed paths with a guild official's ceremonial dress. The street itself became a moving display of inequality, aspiration, labor, and identity. And yet, beneath all that difference, the body remained the same vulnerable thing. It needed warmth. It sweated. It itched. Tired. It wanted softness against the skin. It wanted dry feet, covered shoulders, and relief from seams that rubbed too long. This may be the most human way to understand the subject. Medieval clothing was shaped by economics and hierarchy, but it was felt through skin. A history of garments is also a history of small bodily sensations repeated over thousands of days. The same clothes worn for weeks could become almost a second environment. They held the smell of the hearth, the rhythm of work, the damp of weather, the pressure of the belt, the memory of repairs, and the anxiety of public judgment. They could comfort by familiarity and irritate by constant contact. They could protect a person from cold and expose that same person to shame. They could signal humility, poverty, respectability, service, devotion, ambition, or desperation. They were ordinary but never simple. What modern viewers often misunderstand is not merely how dirty medieval clothing could be. It is how meaningful clothing was because it was so hard to obtain, so hard to maintain, and so closely tied to survival. A modern shirt can be bought cheaply, washed easily, and replaced without much thought. A medieval garment could represent a season of labor, a household savings, a dead relative's memory, a servant's position, a bride's respectability, or a poor person's last defense against winter. That is why wearing the same clothes for weeks was not always a sign of ignorance or indifference. Sometimes it was poverty. Sometimes it was practicality. Sometimes it was the careful preservation of valuable outer garments. Sometimes it was the lack of drying weather. Sometimes it was illness, travel, labor, war, or household shortage. Sometimes it was simply the rhythm of a world where cloth was expensive and human labor was everywhere inside it. Still, we should not soften the hardship too much. The experience could be deeply uncomfortable. Clothes could smell, scratch, cling, stiffen, rot, harbor pests, and mark the wearer with visible signs of exhaustion or want. A poor person did not need a modern laundry room to know the relief of clean linen. A laborer did not need modern hygiene theory to dislike damp wool against the body. A mother did not need modern consumer habits to worry over a child's torn garment before winter. Medieval people were different from us in circumstances, not in the basic human wish to be warm, clean enough, and seen with dignity. And dignity is perhaps the thread that ties the whole story together. The patched tunic, the carefully stored feast day garment, the brushed cloak, the washed head covering, the mended hose, the inherited belt, the second-hand gown, the servant's livery, the monk's habit, the noble's robe. All of them show people trying to live within limits. Some limits were material, some were social, some were religious, some were imposed by rank, gender, weather, work, or money. But inside those limits, people still made choices. They repaired, they saved, they covered, they displayed, they endured. If we imagine a medieval person at the end of a long day, sitting close to the fire while smoke darkens the room, the clothing on their body is no longer just a historical detail. It is the day itself made visible. The hem carries the road. The sleeve carries work. The linen carries the body. The belt carries tools and small necessities. The patch carries someone's care. The smell of smoke carries the house. The worn fabric carries time. And then morning comes again. The same garment is lifted, shaken, fastened, belted, and taken back into the world. It does not feel new. It does not promise comfort, but it still protects. It still identifies. It still allows the person to step outside, meet the weather, face the community, and continue. So when we ask what it was like to wear the same clothes for weeks in medieval Europe, the answer is not just that life was dirtier, harsher, or less convenient. It is that clothing belonged to a world where almost nothing was easy to replace, where cleanliness required labor, where appearance carried judgment, and where a single garment could hold the pressure of an entire household. Perhaps the detail worth thinking about is not only the smell or the discomfort, but the patience of mending what was torn, the patience of washing when water, weather, and time allowed, the patience of wearing what one had, even after it had become rough, old, and too familiar, the patience of saving the better garment for a day when being seen mattered, the patience of living in a world where cloth was precious because life demanded so much from it. And maybe that is why this quiet subject stays with us. It brings history down from castles and battles into the place where the past touched the skin. It reminds us that ordinary people did not live inside grand events most of the time. They lived inside garments, rooms, weather, work, hunger, warmth, embarrassment, care, and habit. They lived through the small material facts that shaped every hour. If one detail from this world surprised you most, or if there is another everyday part of medieval life you would like to hear about next, you can share it in the comments. And if this kind of calm, thoughtful history is something you enjoy returning to, subscribing is a quiet way to keep these long journeys through the past close at hand. For now, the next time we casually change clothes, start a washing machine, or pull a clean shirt from a drawer without thinking, it may be worth remembering the medieval hands that spun, washed, patched, carried, and wore cloth until every thread had earned its place.